am also pleased to join my esteemed colleagues on this panel. I'll make some brief 30,000-foot comments on the drivers and what we should expect moving forward and we should not expect, and then some U.S. policy responses linked to this. Note my preface, these are my views, they're not those of the U.S. government, the Department of Defense, or the National Defense University. Now, we all know that this crisis is not new. It's flared up in different forms over the past 40 years since the late 1980s. But the point is there are long-term structural and deeply rooted political components. So for us, it's not looking at why is Ankara pursuing the PKK. It's very evident. It's a threat to its territorial integrity. But the reach of the problem, when we address this, how has Ankara been able to, quite frankly, easily expand its military presence? And to me, there's three conditions or trends. Most importantly is the weakening and the breakdown of the Iraqi state, and I will also say the Syrian state, that has allowed the proliferation of militias, the inability of the central government to control borders. You have the transnationalization of the PKK issue, which now includes the role of the PYD in Syria. And then you also have the proliferation of militias across the country. All of this has been superimposed. And now you have the use of drone warfare and technology that's making this even more lethal. So the point is, as long as these conditions remain, we should expect Turkey to pursue the PKK military across borders and these types of crises to flare up. The second point I want to make is our partners, neither Baghdad nor Erbil in Iraq, and I don't think Turkey has the political will, or in Iraq has the political will or the capability to effectively mitigate this crisis or to prevent a Turkish incursion. Now, the Iraqi government may make public statements about Turkey's failure to respect its sovereignty, but it tacitly has allowed these cross-border threats to continue. And in my view, this is particularly, these threats are not affecting Baghdad as much as they are affecting directly the Kurdistan region and populations in northern Iraq. This is not the priority, where the Baghdad's priority is central and southern Iraq. So again, there's important ties moving forward. I don't see Baghdad wanting to undermine its ties to Turkey, particularly when this is not an immediate threat. Kurdistan Regional Government, very important partner here, but that's also failed to thwart Turkey's incursion. And in fact, we should not expect much because Erbil's highly dependent on Turkey. They have much to gain. They need to assure their own stability and security of the region, and the PKK represents a direct challenge to the KDP and particularly Barzani's control of Sinjar. So we all know that much of this creation of these military bases were done tacitly with the Kurdistan Regional Government authorities. So these realities, here's the realities. The conflict's deeply rooted. It's become more complex and tied to the breakdown of the Iraqi and Syrian states. We have the expansion of the PKK across borders, Iran, Syria, Iraq, and you have a disinterested Baghdad and a dependent Kurdistan region shaping what we should expect and we should not expect from our policy. So I'll make some points about our US policy. The United States will continue to call on Turkey and Iraq to resolve this problem peacefully, to work towards stabilizing Iraq, reconstructing the disputed territories, assuring minority group rights, and so that local populations themselves can reject the PKK presence. However, the United States also regards this crisis as a bilateral issue between the governments of Turkey and Iraq, and we recognize the Kurdistan region as a critical, integral actor and one that requires its leaders to resolve. We will certainly continue to engage in diplomatic measures, but we do need the political will of the governments of Iraq and Turkey. We can't want this more than our local partners. But please note too, US policy responses are also shaped by trends in our foreign policy. And one of which is the days of liberal interventionism are pretty much over, at least for the time being. So that means large-scale nation building, efforts to fix failed states, promote democracy. This is very important. And the Biden administration certainly is not isolationist. But our priorities from the Washington perspective are bringing America back better, ending forever wars, focusing on great power competition and China's influence globally. This is not to say the Middle East or this crisis is not essential. We're going to continue to focus on countering ISIS, seeking to end the war in Yemen, and working with our partners and allies. But it is an approach that is a pragmatic one to realize our objectives. And no, we all know we will continue to maintain our important relationship with Turkey as a security partner, as a NATO member, as a member of the Defeat ISIS coalition. And we continue to recognize the PKK as a terrorist organization, despite the strains in our relationship right now. So how, given all of these, I don't want to be too negative starting it out, but giving all of these realities, what are some of the measures we can engage? First, again, I start with this is happening in a weak Iraqi state that can't control its borders, where the PKK and non-state armed groups and other militia groups backed by Iran can access revenues, control territory. So we can help encourage ways to enhance Turkey's state relations, to enhance the relationships with the Kurdistan Regional Government and its Iraqi component as well. Turkey's reopening of the consul in Mosul is a positive step, in my view, in this direction. We can enhance ways to improve the economy of Iraq, business opportunities with local communities, and of course, reconstruct liberated areas so that these communities can go home, and we can at least assure a modicum of stability at a local level. Ultimately, in my view, Turkey, we can't kick the can down the road. The future is addressing its own Kurdish issue and limiting the reach of the PKK to opportunistically control other Kurdish groups that it seeks as a challenge to its authority. And this is a very tough nut to crack. We can discuss later, but to me, this is the source of the issue. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Denise. That's actually very helpful. That we most certainly will be coming back to you for some, let's say, extended thoughts on some of the issues you've raised so eloquently, particularly where it relates, of course, to the broader dynamics, or the essence, rather, some might say, of this crisis, the conflict, which is the long-standing 4 decades, 5 decades long Turkey PKK crisis or conflict. Let's move on to you, Osman, if I may. Turkey's Iraq policy used to be rather straightforward, both pre and, let's say, to an extent after the immediate aftermath of the invasion of Iraq. Centered on the PKK, limited, rather intermittent, let's say, strikes and incursions here or there towards the late 1990s, and again, of course, in the immediate aftermath of 2003, building political ties across the Iraqi political spectrum. The KRG most notably, but in Baghdad, Turkish soft power, Turkish businesses, Turkish engagement more widely is rather, let's say, deep-rooted. And of course, in Mosul as well, which is well known by, I'm pretty sure amongst our audience and others who follow Iraq and Turkey rather closely. But it's now a lot more complicated than that. It's been undermined by the Syria crisis and conflict, the emergence, proliferation, ascension of Iran-aligned militias who have increased, let's say, their attacks, their rhetoric against Turkey and its presence in northern Iraq, and have a rather interesting, let's say, relationship with PKK affiliates in northern Iraq. It'd be good to get your thoughts on how you see the relationship in general developing, but also whether Turkey might respond anytime soon in the medium future to the recent attack on its forces in northern Iraq. The floor is yours, Osman.
Thank you, Ranj. Thank you, and for the Carnegie Corporation, and of course the panelists to be here. It is an honor for me as well. Indeed, I was planning to give a bit detail about the Turkish-Iraqi relations, but then it's just go straightly to the issue, the PKK problem between the countries, and that's why I will try to focus on it. Indeed, the Turkish-Baghdadi relations after the 2003 operation was waiving. At the outset, it was very difficult for Turkey to have relations with Baghdad because it was saying no to American incursion. It was saying no to the Kurdish authorities in the northern Iraq, and then it has no relations with the Shia. But after a while, it had very good relations and preferred the strong Iraq, and even just supporting the Iraqi-list, the Ayatollah Wizrist, and then the Maliki destroyed not only the relations with Turkey, but also the general political fabric of Iraq. And after Turkey turned back to inwards, and now there's a low-profile relations between Baghdad and Ankara. Regarding KRG, Kurdistan Regional Government, again, it was a bit problematic, and especially after late Mr. Talabani's presidency, it became changed, and Turkey had very good relations with KRG, the energy links, and then the independence referendum just put everything in the deep freeze. And now, as far as I know, today, the shock of independence referendum was passed. And now PKK threat to both KRG and Turkey is bringing Erbil and Ankara together. And I think, and as far as I understand, Ankara is happy with this cooperation. And Denise put very clearly why Turkey had such kind of an incursion in Syria and Iraq, because there's no authority at the other side of the border, and Turkey need to take measures for its own security. But we need to put very clearly, PKK was a security threat to Turkey. But now, with its complex relations with Iran, with Hashti Shabi is, linked to the Iraqi prime minister, but it is an Iranian proxy, and it's linked with, Damascus in Syria, and its relations with the United States through PYD, and the Russian influence, it became much more complex, and it is much more a political threat rather than a security threat for Turkey. The PKK is happening. On the relations with KRG, on the KRG controlled region, there's not too much problem. Yes, Turkey is having military operations, cross-border military operations. Kazemi government, as the previous Baghdadi governments, are just rejecting this, but they do not have so many things to do. But KRG is having a cooperation with Turkey regarding combating with PKK. But the Mosul and Sinjar, they are not part of KRG, and that's why Turkey needs to tackle with this issue by his own means. But again, Iran is on the picture. Why? Because Sinjar is not an PKK Turkish issue, because Sinjar is at the crossroads of Iranian support to Syria, and it's just bringing Iran and Turkey as rivals in the region, and that's why I think the elephant in the room today is Iran, and PKK. There's a problem for Turkey. Why? Because the criminalization of the Kurdish problem in Turkey and the nationalist discourse of the Erdogan government is making the relations with KRG is not so easy, and there's any kind of political solution to the problem in the foreseeable future. And that's why the military means is at the table right now, and Turkey will use it. But Sinjar, there's two problems. One is the Iranian influence in Sinjar, and the second is it is not too close to the Turkish borders, like the peace spring operation in Syria and the cross-border operations in northern Iraq. Sinjar is a bit deeper into to Iraq and between the Syrian-Iraqi relations and the borders, and that's why it is not very easy. But it doesn't mean that with the drone technology, Turkey won't be making any kind of operation in Sinjar. What will be important from now on is the role will be played by Iran. I think the JCPOA is very important because at the outset, almost the same stuff was controlling the Iraqi policies of the United States. Mr. McCurk, we can count his name, and the United States didn't take into consideration the Ankara's warnings regarding the Iranian influence in the region. Okay, make a deal with Iran on nuclear issue, but Iran shouldn't have the upper hand in the region. Because for the Europeans and the Americans, the nuclear dossier is the main priority. But for the people and the countries in the region, Iranian proxies and Iranian influence in the region is more important. If with JCPOA, a revised version to whatever you call it, and Iran had again the upper hand in the region, it will be a problematic issue. And again, PKK is has a relation with Hashti Shabi as well. And that's why we need to be very careful on that. And from this angle, I think we can look at the rapprochement between the Saudi Arabia and Turkey from this angle, because always, the Sunni balance and between the Iranians, probably Turkey doesn't want Saudi Arabia to be led alone with Iran, because they have some contacts with each other and try to be close to Saudi Arabia, and in order to balance Iran as well. And let me stop here. There are so many things others, but I think time is up. And with the questions, we can elaborate on it a bit.
Thanks very much indeed, Osman. Absolutely, we most certainly will be coming back to you. Certainly, again, like I said to Denise, to unpack some of the issues you've raised, the challenges. It was also very helpful to get a, let's say, a sort of overview of how the current state of affairs came to be, and how we ended up here. And I'd welcome the other panelists and their thoughts and reactions to some of that, to that diagnosis, let's say. Of course, we do want prognosis as well. So I will be asking each of you for some policy recommendations as the discussion develops, or at least your thoughts on how things should move forward. Speaking of moving forward and policy recommendations, let's come to Lahib now for her thoughts on the recently signed Sinjar agreement, which in a nutshell, I guess, is an agreement that was signed by Erbil, the KRG, and Baghdad, with the support of the international community, the Americans, the Europeans, the UN as well, I believe. As part of this effort, this long-standing now, I guess, effort to try and resolve the crisis in Sinjar as part of a much broader imperative of encouraging refugees, IDPs to return, to reconstruct Sinjar and the areas in and around the Nineveh Plains. But of course, it was also resisted, the Sinjar agreement, by some of those actors like the PKK and its affiliates, like Iran-aligned groups, who are now stationed, rather entrenched in Sinjar, and who refuse to leave, to put it very simply. Lahib, let me give you the floor for your thoughts on the Sinjar agreement, and perhaps some thoughts and perspectives on how the situation could perhaps be resolved without an intervention from the Turkish side, at least, or without the situation from becoming too volatile over the coming weeks. The floor is yours, Lahib.
Thank you very much, Ranjan, and for organizing this very timely panel. I will take off from Denise's points, which I think are really at the root of this issue too, which is what she mentioned, the weakness of the Iraqi state or Baghdad, and also the inability of KRG to have a mitigating role in this. And I think this was really the core issue of the Sinjar agreement, was precisely that these two state and sub-state actors are very weak in their ability to implement a new agreement or to impose a new order in Sinjar. Number one, Erbil and Baghdad came to an agreement together without the other main stakeholders that actually have the power on the ground involved in the agreement. It doesn't mean that they didn't reach out or that there wasn't conversations with them. But at the end of the day, if you look at how the agreement is outlined, it speaks about setting up a new security configuration for Sinjar that is supposed to draw on local forces, in this case, recruitment from Yazidis that are still displaced in Duhok, 1,500, and then 1,000 from Sinjar in particular. Now, for those that are still local to the area, and those are mainly those that are affiliated to the PKK and the YBS in this case, which is the most salient Yazidi affiliate inside Sinjar. The proposal is rejected because it is seen as a sort of going back to the former order, where the KDP was in control of the area, and I mean pre-2014, of course. And one of the elements that I think was overlooked by Baghdad and ignored by the KRG counterpart is the fact that many Yazidis refuse a kind of return to that old order because of what happened during the war with ISIS, where many Yazidis considered themselves abandoned, both by Baghdad and by Erbil. So you have an element where the local groups are genuinely loyal to this external force, as we can call it, which is the PKK. And of course, there is another element, which is that is where they have found employment. And ironically, through the Iraqi state for a very long time, as the YBS was on the payroll of the Hashd al-Sha'bi, and to a certain degree remains so. So what we have is on the ground domination of PKK and its affiliates, supported by another sub-state actor in Iraq, which is the PMF. So interestingly, you have the formal institutions, which is the government of Erbil and Baghdad, coming to an agreement without really having anchored the pillars of that agreement with those that control the ground. And so hence, as you said, Ranj, we've seen a large pushback in trying to implement that agreement, with the result that we still have no significant, some returns of displaced people to Sinjar, but not in the numbers that we'd like to see. And I would say that, unfortunately, the role of the international community, including the UN, European countries, and the US, was maybe too optimistic, in the sense of, okay, we hope that this can lead to something, but knowing the weakness of the Iraqi state and of the KRG to actually change the reality on the ground. I think what would have been more important would have been to work for a longer period on this agreement in backroom sort of dialogues that could have brought these actors into compliance. Right now, we have no compliance. Baghdad has indeed dispatched forces such as the federal police and the army to the area, but they are still very much on the periphery of managing security inside the district. The initial withdrawals that we had of PKK affiliated groups was very, very brief, and they're very much back into the district, both with their armed presence, but also within the administration. Simultaneously, the former administration that considers itself the legitimate one, which is the former KDP mayor, is still not able to take part in implementing a new administration. So this speaks very much to, I think, too optimistic ideas of what Baghdad and Erbil are actually able to do, and very little ability to do anything on the ground. At the same time, Turkey is waiting on the sidelines, giving some slack to see what can be done in terms of the withdrawal. But I think the reality is very clear for everyone right now that there will be no new security configuration in Sinjar, which is going to marginalize the PKK and its affiliates. I'll stop there, and I can continue with questions.
Well, that's extremely helpful and instructive, Lahib. And again, I think you touched on a number of important, well, both themes, but I guess issues that clearly indicate this will be a protracted issue. And from what I could gather from your remarks, the key is actually to try and ensure it doesn't transition into a protracted conflict, even if it will be a extended crisis for the foreseeable future. I will come back to you because you did emphasize a fair bit the question of implementation. The lack of authority on the ground on the part of the KRG and Baghdad makes it rather difficult or implausible to implement something like the Sinjar agreement. I did like your emphasis on the back channel discussions and dialogue that could have maybe preceded the agreement. But I will come back just to maybe push you a bit on what form implementation should take, because like Denise alluded to, this goes to the heart of many crises in Iraq. It's state weakness, it's the weakness of institutions, but also it's the legacy of the campaign to defeat ISIS. It's the legacy of ISIS emergence in 2014. So again, lots to unpack, and we'll be coming back to you. Let's turn to you, Guney, for some thoughts and reactions. I know you'll be covering a number of issues in relation to the Turkey PKK conflict, but the two questions I have on my mind, and I'm sure others do, is what sort of future awaits the PKK in its different forms? PKK, its affiliates in Syria, in Iraq, but also what role can European powers play, particularly actors like the French, who have rather close and ongoing relations with the likes of PKK affiliates or sister organizations like the YPG, rather strong ties to the KRG and with Baghdad. What sort of role could perhaps the Europeans play in this, in all this, which has generally been framed as within a US, Turkey, Iraq-centric lens, but clearly, based on what Denise has told us, we might be seeing, let's say, a retraction of US involvement in conflicts like this, a aversion to getting too engulfed in these sort of crises? Does that suggest perhaps there could be an opening for the Europeans to come in and address at least some of the layers that comprise this conflict? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Ranj, for inviting me to talk among such distinguished panelists. Your question about the PKK, I mean, let me say something brief on it, and then I'll go back to, I think, the broader picture. I think the jury is still out on that question, what will happen to the PKK in the future. And I believe the PKK is currently politically defeated, both in Syria and in Turkey. I'll expand on this later, but Turkey lost its opportunity. The 2020 was the golden year for Turkey, both in terms of their air domination, their edge on drone technology, also on with regard to the international alliance against the PKK. Turkey had both Russia, the US, and Iran on the side, on its side. So 2020 was the year when Turkey had to get some results, the concrete results against the PKK, and I think that opportunity has lost now. I think the situation is turning. So no defeats or victories are permanent, obviously, and I'll expand on this later. But I think broadly, what we should do is to look at the other question you've provided me earlier, how integral Turkey's Turkey-KRG relationship in maintaining a buffer against Iran and its proxies. As Osman mentioned earlier, Iran is the elephant in the room here. I think the main driver of Turkey's KRG policy is not to balance Iran, but the main driver is the PKK. And I think, in fact, Turkey doesn't necessarily have a KRG policy per se. It has a KDP policy, Kurdistan Democratic Party policy, a PUK policy, a PKK policy, and a broader Kurdish policy. And these represent itself in different forms, which I'll try to expand. And I think we need to understand Turkey's relationship with Iran in overlapping triangles. So there is one triangle, Turkey, Russia, and Iran triangle in Syria, which is increasingly sidelining Iran. And there is a Turkish-Azeri-Iran triangle, which is also quite adversarial against Iran. There's the Turkey, US, and Iran triangle, in which Turkey is not necessarily a full partner with the US and try to balance between all. And when it comes to the Turkey-KRG relations, it is, it's not necessarily anti-Iran. I think that plays a role, but not the main driver. But there's also another triangle that involves Turkey, Iran, Ankara, Tehran, and Baghdad against the Kurds, which a mechanism which was activated during the KRG's independence referendum, and that which successfully put a lid on Kurdish aspirations at that time. Even Syria could come into coordinating against the Kurds in this context, I think. But so Turkey and Iran is at loggerheads, both in Syria, South Caucasus, and increasingly in Iraq, in Iraqi Kurdistan and areas beyond the current Kurdistan region. And I think Iran also has more leverage against Turkey than vice versa. And also the Kurdish issue, the violent aspect of the Kurdish issue plays a significant role in this way. And Turkish foreign policy on Iraq is very much fragmented. There is not necessarily a broader Iraqi policy, but Turkey has different policies towards different provinces of Iraq. So in Mosul and Bashika, obviously, Turkey sides with the KDP against Baghdad. In Kirkuk, previously during the referendum, Turkey sided with Baghdad against the KRG. In Sinjar, it is a different scenario, I think. Turkey wants to exert itself in the long run. So the KDP there is maybe a short-term partner, but the main adversary is there is both obviously the PKK, but also Baghdad. So in this, another question, excellent question you provided me with was whether the PKK presence in Iraqi Kurdistan is sustainable, especially under in the context of the recent conflict. And I think it is sustainable, And I have three arguments for that. One is that we can test this idea by looking inside Turkey. So the PKK is still present, despite the dominance of Turkey on all fronts in 2020. It's still present inside Turkey. Obviously, a much limited presence. Second is they are slowly adapting to the new high-tech armed drones plus GPS technology and the intelligence war. So they are reconsidering the rules of their combat. And the third is the international alliance might be crumbling. I mean, Turkey, we no longer have Trump plus James Jeffrey from the US side. We no longer have Iran fully on Turkish side, not fully maybe, but much more than today. And also Russia is less dependent on Turkey. And there are also other Gulf actors from UAE and maybe other countries. And in this context, still, I think it might be possible if strong political moves have taken against the PKK to push the group to withdraw from Iraq in the long run. But the opposite of that is happening now, because the organization, the group is backed against the corner with no alternative shown. So this was another question. If pushing them away from Iraqi Kurdistan, in a context of a resolution process or peace process in Turkey, you can speculate many alternatives of the PKK leaving Iraq and agreeing to the authority of the KRG broadly. But at the moment, they are not given any alternatives. Second is that Turkey's counterterrorism and counterinsurgency strategy is flawed, politically flawed. I mean, you have, for example, a full crackdown on the organization, but you don't, which needs to be complemented with winning hearts and minds kind of operation, which we don't see necessarily. So inside Turkey, for example, the PKK is very much limited militarily. But you see the government is going after the legal representatives, the legal political parties, their municipalities in Turkey. So it's flawed politically. And also another example is what Turkey did in Syria. And interestingly, the statements about the recent Turkish operation in Iraqi Kurdistan against the PKK is being made by Turkish interior minister. So not the foreign minister, not the president, but the interior minister, as if it is an internal issue. And the interior minister, Süleyman Soylu, made several references to Syria. He said, we will do the same as we did in Syria, disregarding the differences between Iraqi Kurdistan and northern Syria, where you have a partner and a legitimate partner, I mean, in Iraqi Kurdistan, which you lack necessarily normally in Syria. But from his perspective, I think that he sees two situations very closely. And what they have done in
30 seconds, if you could wrap up.
Okay, so what did they have done in Afrin, for example, when they defeated the PKK-linked organizations? Is that they didn't necessarily replace it with, Afrin is a Kurdish majority area, and it replaced it with the KNC, the Kurdistan National Council, which is an anti-PKK group. But they replaced it with the pro-Turkish Free Syrian Army groups. So I think these gives us clues as to where Turkey would go and what is the problem with the Turkish policy.
That's excellent. Again, very helpful, Guney. So much to unpack there, no doubt. And we'll be coming back to you for some extended remarks as the conversation develops. Before I get questions and interventions from the audience, I would like to bring Denise back into this, because the sort of sense that I get from, let's say, the US perspective, at least for now, is that it's more of a focus on damage control rather than proactively try to shift some of these dynamics in one direction or another. And clearly, as we've quite heard, the intricacies are, far too, let's say, deep-rooted. There are numerous complexities and moving pieces, again, that comprise this current situation that you have in northern Iraq. And of course, you have the whole historical legacy and aspects of the Turkey PKK conflict. But the sense that I get, at least from the US perspective, is that now's the time for damage control to try and prevent conflagrations, try and prevent escalations, try and prevent the situation from markedly declining to an extent where you've essentially got another conflict in the region. And so far, there has been, clearly it seems, some restraint on the part of the Turks, who have been threatening to launch an incursion into northern Iraq for quite some time now, at least into Sinjar. It'd be good to get your reactions to what you've heard and your thoughts on what I've just raised on this question of damage control.
Thanks, Ranj. Just want to clarify, you said before too, damage control, that I wouldn't say we're retrenching. The United States, Iraq is an essential partner, a security partner to the United States. Turkey is a very important strategic partner to the United States. So it's about the way that we're going to do this. And that is to say, working with our allies and partners in the region. It's about knowing, there's the root causes of resolving the Kurdish problem in Turkey is not necessarily tied to how do you mitigate conflict? How do you prevent the killings of innocent civilians? How do you look at some of these local level issues while you're also negotiating between the government of Iraq and the government of Turkey? So it's looking at bilateral partnerships and bringing these bilateral partners together to try to diffuse, I would say, how do you diffuse the crisis and the conflict? I do want to make another point to how we were talking about previously, the Sinjar agreement. We just hit the nail on the head. And I'm not one of these real, I don't want to be cynical, but there are the realities on the ground. And so there's going to be I would say two tracks. Somebody talked about a backdoor discussions, but in all of these conflicts that I've experienced around the globe or visited or addressed, you have your national level, state to state, and that's the Turkey, the Iraq level, and then you have the local dynamics on the ground. And there certainly are enough groups knowing that you have to deal with the local actors on the ground. The United States doesn't work directly with sub-state actors at this level. We will work through central governments. And that's the point, as the way that we go about trying to diffuse the conflict is still going to be done through our bilateral, our partners in Turkey and Iraq. Over.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Denise. Let's, Osman, there seems to be some sort of, let's say, middle ground here in the discussion when it comes to, again, constraining the conflict in terms of preventing an implosion of sorts. How, let's say, amenable and to what extent does it work in Turkey's favor, in fact, to make sure you haven't got an escalation in northern Iraq that obviously undermines Turkey's key allies in Iraq, that could have some spillover impact for Turkey, perhaps in respect of its domestic political dynamics, in respect of its interest in Syria. What sort of, let's say, approach could we expect from Ankara when it comes to this question of constraining the dynamics and the potential for this to become a much more serious, more protracted conflict?
Thank you, Ranj. Indeed, as Dennis put it, the solution is not in Sinjar or in Mosul. The solution is in Baghdad. Turkey cannot, cope with the terrorist organizations or the security threats in Sinjar only or in Mosul only, unless the Baghdad government can establish itself as a central government and controlling Iraq as an important actor. Then the problems can go away. Otherwise, always Iraq, Iran, the Turkey, Iran, and Syria, and the United States will try to balance the local authorities. And local authorities play their own game with their own rules. And the big, actors as states, as capitals, as diplomats or as policymakers, it is not very easy for them to cope with the local actors because they have their own priorities. And Iran has an experience to deal with this, the proxies and the local authorities, because it has a link with this. Regarding attention to Turkey, of course, it's important. The KRG is almost the only stable region over there. As Guney put it, it is not KRG, but KDP region, because with PUK, Turkey already doesn't have any relation. The PUK has a relation with Iran and sometimes with the PKK. It is divided among itself. Turkey's relations with KRG means relations with KDP. And this stability and the strong position should be kept. And Turkey will be supporting KDP in any way. against PKK or ISIS, and it is important. But as far as, unless, the central authorities, both in Damascus, of course, not with Bashar Assad for Ankara perspective, the central authorities getting stronger, it will be very difficult to reach at any kind of stability in the region. And Turkey will try to solve its own problems with own means. And it is very difficult for Turkey to close his eyes to these problems.
And what does own means mean exactly, Osman?
Unfortunately, this is the military means. At the outset, there are some aspects. First of all, Turkey is losing its diplomatic capacity and diplomatic means in the region because it has very broad reasons. But unfortunately, the hard power is working in the region. It worked in Syria and it's working in Iraq, and Turkey now knows to use this hard power. But regarding the diplomatic capacity, we can say that Turkey has the same capacity as it had at 2010, for instance, having relations with from Ammar al-Hakim to all actors in Baghdad. Now just through the embassy and through diplomatic means, it is having some relations, but unfortunately, it doesn't have some local level relations. And the ISIS operation, ISIS invasion of Mosul consulate just put a blow on Turkish ability in the region as well. And the only thing that with this drone technology, the military means, seemingly it is the only thing. The other one was a political process. Guney also underlined this. The political process may have played a role solving the PKK issue, but we passed away from this. Now the Turkish government is using only the security apparatus against the PKK problem and the Kurdish problem, and just going after the political figures in Turkey, and that's why the only remaining thing is the security apparatus in the hands of Turkey.
Right, thanks very much. Let's Lahib, can I bring you back in on this question of implementation and sustainability? One gets the sense here that the longer this crisis goes on, in many respects, it actually favors the likes of the PKK and its affiliates, but also Iran-aligned groups, because on the ground, it's very obvious that they are very determined, focused, very effective in consolidating their presence, expanding their support networks, patronage networks. And as you said earlier, they do have enough local support to use as a foundation for all that. So if you've got a situation where you've got one actor, Turkey, which is itching for an intervention to try, even if Turkey doesn't resolve the problem, from Ankara's perspective, as we've heard from Osman, is that a bloody nose approach is perfectly fine, in that you're not resolving the problem, you're not eliminating the problem, but you're still making life a lot more difficult. But in turn, that has implications for stability in Iraq, for Baghdad, for the KRG. So I'd be keen to bring you back in on this question of implementation. How, what sort of, let's say, least worst case scenario could emerge from all this?
Okay, well, I would like to address also one thing that both Denise and Osman raised, which is the emphasis on Baghdad and the state-to-state relations. When we, on the one hand, have established that Baghdad is very weak, we also have to think about which Baghdad. And when we talk about Baghdad, what does it mean for Baghdad to control its borders, to reimpose order? Unfortunately, I mean, in this case, that there is no talk about the government as such doing that. If you look at how the implementation is going right now, with the attempts of coming to some sort of implementation, it is different security institutions in Iraq that are responsible. You would have to, the National Security Advisor has very much of a front figure role to play, but he also, Qasim al-Araji, is a former Minister of Interior, has good relations with the PMF side, and that is required to get anything going. So I think what is important, both for actors such as the US and for Turkey, to recognize that and to speak about that, just as the US is pragmatic in Syria, for example. At the end of the day, the PYD and the YPG are important allies there. On the Iraqi side, it's a little bit the other way around. But at the end of the day, we need to recognize those sub-state actors as actors that need to be spoken to. It cannot be left to the government of Iraq alone to do it, because they essentially don't have the networks to influence. But there are other actors that have that. The US has its contacts, Turkey has its contacts, and they also have bilateral, at least for Turkey, channels to Iran, even if they don't speak about these kind of sub-conflicts. But that is important, I think, and that is where we can, prevent the worst case scenario. And I, of course, there are conversations on this going on. There are attempts at intra-Kurdish dialogue, across the borders between the countries in the region. Those things are important, though that is what will enable for Sinjar to be resolved. It cannot be resolved in isolation from all of these other things. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks, Lahib. Denise, did you have a 2-minute intervention?
I do have a 2-minute intervention, and I just wanted to clarify. Lahib, I completely agree with you. When we say negotiating through Baghdad and Turkey, I don't mean going in a nice room with chairs and having these discussions. They using those official groups affiliated with them. And if that means contacting so-and-so leader who's got ties to this PMF, which, there are some PMF who are officially in the government, but it is using the networks that it has to make, to diffuse the situation. And so I think that there's not enough political will, personally, okay? Because this is the PKK, but it's all of the other PMF that don't belong in Sinjar either. So Baghdad has been promising we're going to remove these PMF for how long? And they're still there. So, it's making these side deals with the exact local groups that you're talking about. This cannot be done by ignoring the sub-state actors on the ground. I just meant it also can be done through the paymasters. And the paymasters, if they had the political will, they can, to some extent, weaken this presence. So it's got to be done at 2 levels. And I just want to say,
can I ask Denise very quickly, because you could have an entire conference on this question, but in terms of Baghdad being unable to do much about these groups, as you know very well, Baghdad has been trying, but in quotation marks, trying, one can say. I mean, what sort of what could be done, in realistically speaking, over the coming?
Yeah, I mean, again, I'll speak bluntly. I mean, maybe it's a level of frustration too. We have good partners in Iraq, the prime minister and the president, but the calls to the PMF to leave the north have been going on well before the current leadership in Baghdad, and they have little control over many of the militias in Iraq right now. We know this. These militias now have been given salaries so that they are part officially, and you've got some that are part and some that are not. So a little bit more pressure on getting these groups out of the region. So if they had some of the more political will to remove them, to lead this effort. But as I said initially, this is the North. And I don't see as enough concern about some of the destabilizing effects that are going in the north of Iraq, that if this situation were going on in the south and central of Iraq, you may have a different sense of urgency. So, and of course, there's serious economic issues in the country. There's all of these other problems of unemployment that they're dealing with. It's just that dealing with this also has to be part of the Kurdistan regional government and the local authorities in each of these regions. So I think more can be done in pressing the Iraqi government to take some of these actions, but that means the Iraqi government working with the real leaders who control these militia groups. And we all know who they are. Over.
Sorry, thank you. Thanks so much, Denise. We're now going to turn to the audience for some interventions. And we do have Kamaran Palani, who was recently in the Nineveh Plains. I'm not too sure if you were in Sinjar itself, but perhaps you can come in, Kamaran, with some of the intricacies and a more, let's say, granular take on some of these on-the-ground dynamics. The floor is yours, Kamaran.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Kagran, and thank you for the speakers. I just would like to—
Can you also introduce yourself? Sorry,
yeah.
Kamaran.
I'm Kamran Palani, Associate Fellow at Al-Sharq Strategic Research. I'm also Research Fellow at Middle East Research Institute. I have been to Nineveh, I've been to Sinjar, and recently many times, and I spent days and nights there. I just would like to focus on one thing. Sinjar is part of a broader security setting and power structure that has been in place across disputed territories, from Jalaula in the province of Diyala to Duskhurmatu in Salahuddin, to the whole province of Kirkuk and Nineveh plains. So Sinjar is not isolated from the security setting that has been in place since 2017. What I'm seeing on the ground, there are 4 elements, and or let's put in this way, the security setting in these regions, including Sinjar, has 4 main features and elements. First is the suspension of normal politics. And if you go to Mosul, you still see this is a very militarized zone. If you go to Sinjar, you believe that you are not in the peace building phase. You are still in a very short-term stabilization period. Second pillar of the security setting in this region is the which is very relevant to your discussions, is the creation of new enemies. Hashd al-Sha'bi militias specifically, and let's make this very clear. It's true that there are non-Iranian elements within Hashd al-Sha'bi, but across the disputed territories, from Jalaula in the province of Diyala to Sinjar, all of them controlled by the Iranian-backed militias, from the Badr organization, Asayib Ahl al-Haq, all the other organizations. So the whole territories are under the control of the Iranian-backed militias, not other non-Iranian aligned Hashd al-Sha'bi. So these groups need new enemies to continue to justify their presence, to construct new threats. And I argue that Iraqi Kurdistan, specifically KDP and Turkey, is the main target to the process of the new enemies construction in these regions. And the third element of the security setting in this region is as you have all discussed, is the weakening of the state institutions and control. You cannot maintain this security setting with strong state control and institutions. And the fourth, which is really very sensitive, I define it as militarization of ethno-religious minorities in these regions. Iranian-backed militias have created armed groups within Christians, within Turkmens, within Shabaks, within Yazidis. Now they are trying within Kakais. And this has complicated any government-to-government efforts to resolve the disputed territories. They have completely transformed the nature of disputed territories from a conflict between 2 governments to a very complex situation with militarization of ethno-religious minorities is the central of the security setting. So simply and quickly, I predict more and new tensions in the near future. We are not in the phase of post-Daesh peace building yet. And these new tensions, whether it's between Turkey and Iranian-backed militias or between KRG Iranian-backed militias within communities, I think they are likely in the future.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Kamran. That's very helpful indeed. Let me, Guney, building on that, so I did ask earlier what would be a sort of least worst case scenario to both Denise and I believe to a lesser extent Lahib, but also Osman. What would be the least worst case scenario for the PKK and its affiliates in northern Iraq? What exactly are we talking about in terms of what could be a very acceptable outcome to the group? Guney.
I think that the current status quo isn't too bad for the PKK. I think there were 2 flawed attempts of changing the status quo in the past. One of them was in Syria, where the U.S. withdrawal benefited Russia, and the second attempted change of status quo was in Sinjar, where the push against the PKK also this time benefited Iran. I think the enemies of the PKK should confront the PKK politically. The military approach disregarding the political aspects benefits the organization. I mean, if people think extreme military pressure will make the organization go away, I think this is the very habitat of the organization that they, right from the beginning, that they kind of continue. With regard to this tension between Iran, broader tension between Iran and Turkey, and the PKK being in the middle of in between US and Iran on two sides, I think that the dilemma they have is what they can achieve, what they can hope for from the West is any kind of recognition. Obviously, the PKK or any affiliates or any distant affiliates cannot hope for any sophisticated weapons from the Western Bloc. So US will never provide any weapons that will help the PKK to confront any sophisticated Turkish weapons. But US could provide some sort of recognition to the PKK or their affiliates, which didn't happen even at the best of times, which was for them, I mean, when they were, when the ISIS threat was very significant, when Turkey had many problems with Turkey. So it didn't happen at that time. I doubt it will happen anytime soon of any kind of recognition, like bringing them in Geneva platform or whatever. With regard to the East, the recognition or political support from Russia or Iran wouldn't mean much, but the military support from either of them would be very big. What Turkey is trying to do is to push the PKK towards the side of Iran, so that they will have the West on their side. But what the PKK is doing is to try to talk to anyone. And as long as they have Sinjar and some sort of presence in the border areas, they can still, as long as they have connection, they need two connections. One of them is the connection to Syria, and the other one is connection between Turkey and Iraqi Kurdistan. And Turkey is trying to cut both of these connections. By attempting to intervene in Sinjar, they want to cut links between Syria and Iraq, and attempting to with the current operation, they're trying to create a buffer zone, preferably not very much populated, so that to break those links. As long as Turkey fails to achieve these goals, I think it will be good for the organization. There's a saying, I think attributed to Henry Kissinger, which says, if a guerrilla organization is not losing, it is winning. But if a regular army is not winning, it is losing. So I think we need to look at the politics and sociological levels.
Thank you. Very helpful, Guney. Osman, Denise, is that a 2 minute, two finger intervention? So you're on mute, Denise. You're on mute.
It's a question I'd like to follow up with Guney. Turkey has its partners in the north, you said particularly the KDP, and they're working well together. But does anybody here really think that the KRG, the KDP, can, and if they could, would expel the PKK from the north? Because it is completely not in their interest to do so. I mean, that's the card that they have. In some ways, that certainly they're at odds with the PKK for leadership, and it's destabilizing. But you asked Renj, what is the best case scenario? And weak Iraqi state, weak Syrian state, borders that you can go send your people across, right? Cut a deal with the KRG. You'll stay in the Kandil Mountains, and you'll do your bit. So my question is, to what extent is the reality of the PKK being removed, not by Turkey only, but by the local populations who agree to have them there, and that includes the Kurdistan Regional Government? That's my question.
That's very interesting, Denise, because it sort of goes to the essence of the relationship between the PUK and the KDP. And I'm not going to answer the question, by the way, but I'm glad you actually went to the historical context behind this.
I don't want to drag it in, but there's a Kurdish nationalist element here. There's a who who is going to be the person that's going to kill the PKK nationalists. And there's some still people on the streets who have this sentimental, regard. So I'm asking too, where's the red line?
Well, I mean, who wants to, I mean, because Denise also, I don't know if you're also alluding to the historical fact that it was the KDP which enabled the PKK's presence. So a lot of this is
absolutely, Rench.
Right. That's, I think, you go into great details about that in, well, at least 2 of your books, I'm pretty sure, Denise. But in terms of this historical context, it's normally framed as a PKK-KDP crisis, but actually it's a lot more complicated than that. And there is this historical context of both the KDP and the PUK being instrumental enablers of that. So who wants to take that on? Any takers? Guney?
I mean, I can
Osman,
try, obviously.
Lahib?
I mean, this requires especially a KDP representative to respond. But I mean,
KRG representative.
Or a KRG representative. But I think Denise's question was more targeted or focused on the KDP there. I think from a 13,000 feet analysis, Denise, situation might look more simple, and you have both perspectives, both the 30,000 feet and also on the ground perspective on this. From 30,000 feet, you would think 2 Kurdish nationalist groups and an anti-Kurdish nationalist country, and there are much room to cooperate or use as a card or leverage against one another. But I think on the ground, it isn't seen that way. I think the PKK might be provide a card for the KRG broadly against Turkey, but it is also a strong challenge, and you need to gauge between, like, you need to weigh in both things, like how much it's worth as a card against Turkey, and how much it's a challenge politically. So I think the political challenge side is more important, and I think the KRG policymakers' view of Turkey might also be different from some other analysts, including myself, like what Turkey wants to achieve there. In terms of whether the KDP or broader KRG can eliminate the PKK from the area, I think they have a strong card, which is the intelligence card. I mean, we focus very much on with it in the Turkish PKK conflict. We focus very much on the technology, both drone technology and GPS, precise GPS technology. But I think both the Turkish intelligence and other intelligence organizations are not getting enough of kudos or enough of credit here. I think they play a more significant role than drones. And on that front, the KDP plays a very significant role. I mean, a good comparison could be between US drone technology and the Turkish drone technology. I mean, if drones were solutions to fights against non-state actors, then US would have won the war against Taliban in 2005. They have
just wrap up in 30 seconds. Sorry.
Yeah, and also in Syria. I mean, in plain land, the US drones weren't enough, and they needed ground force and intelligence to tackle both the leadership and the militants of the Islamic State. So Turkey needs that too, and there the KDP has a strong card.
Thanks very much, Guney. Osman, is that a two-finger intervention, Lahib? I was going to come to you.
Yes, I wanted to underline just a few points in order to let the time for
I did have a question for you, Osman, but yes. I wanted to double check whether Lahib had a quick two-finger intervention. Was that?
Yeah, sure. I just wanted to add one more thing to that, to what Denise asked, which is about the limits, like where does the limit for this go? And I think what we've seen recently, I mean, over the last year in the Kurdistan region, is that there is a limit to the degree of how much sort of PKK activism you can have, and how far south that is allowed to come into Erbil governorate, but also in Suli. So even if you have, a PUK that is very sympathetic to the PKK, there is even limits there. And I think that's what you see. There's not going to be a Kurdish will to eradicate in any way completely, but to limit that activity and how far it comes into to Iraqi Kurdistan territory.
Sorry, just to clarify, Lahib, did you say there's a element on the part of the PUK to, let's say, manage and contain how far the PKK goes in northern Iraq, just to clarify?
Yes, I think so. I mean, with at the same time, of course, the support ongoing, because there are economic benefits to the relationship with those groups in Syria, for example. So the two are not mutually exclusive. Because at the end of the day, you have a Kurdish constituency in Iraq that is actually impacted by the drone warfare.
Great, thank you. Thanks very much, Lahib. Osman, I know you had some reactions to that, but in addition to your reaction, can I also ask you about, would Turkey be content with the idea that the discussion we're having today could be one we might have 5-10 years from now, where this effectively becomes a very normalized situation, part of the status quo, and not entirely, let's say, novel, not too challenging as far as Turkey's regional national security concerns are concerned? Is this a situation that, from the Turkish perspective, could be a tenable one?
You mean the statu quo is an attainable one for Turkey, you mean?
So what you have right now in northern Iraq, the very discussion we're having today, could it be acceptable for the Turks, for Ankara, that this is something which we could still be talking about 5-10 years from now, where effectively it becomes normalized and it becomes fully part of the status quo?
Yeah, just let me start with the previous question you have asked regarding the least worst scenario for PKK. Yes, I think the statu quo, as Guney underlined, it is the best way for PKK because it is protecting its ability in northern Iraq, in Syria as well. As long as, unless Turkey has a political process, there will be a very difficult a solution for PKK. For instance, in Turkey, yes, PKK has already disappeared in Turkey as a military, as a terrorist organization, but HDP, as the Kurdish party, is getting more than 10%. It is not eradicating, it is not changing, and the people staying over there, and it is sometimes kingmaker, the Kurdish voters in Turkey. And that's why, unless the political cards should be on the table, getting PKK out of northern Iraq or something else, it will be very difficult. What is important for now is the PKK issue is not only between Turkey and the Kurds in Turkey. It is together with the Kurds in Syria and the Kurds in northern Iraq, and with the geopolitical factors and actors. The solution will be a comprehensive thing, and it is not an easy thing. Unless there's a political solution in Syria and to an extent in Iraq, I think it will be very difficult. Regarding the current situation, your final question, this is more or less depends on who is ruling the country 5 or 10 years later. If a flexible country, a flexible ruler, I don't think that the existing government, the Erdogan government, and the nationalist coalition partners will accept this. By the way, any of the the nationalists, any new parties can accept the existing statu quo as a normal thing, but it may be a modus vivendi. But to end the PKK problem and for a comprehensive solution, a political process is something must.
Thanks so much, Osman. We did get a question from a member of the audience who asked, conversely, what can Turkey do to help Baghdad play a more assertive role when it comes to the PKK? But so do have a think about that and how that fits into the broader political dynamics in Iraq. We'll come back to you for that. Lahib, I wanted to bring you back in on the, let's say, intra-Kurdish dynamics behind all this. As I said, the focus generally is on the PKK-KDP rivalry for obvious reasons. But there is also this more, let's say, underreported element when it comes to how the PUK-PKK/YPG relationship has developed rather significantly, which also ties into the war on ISIS, US dependence on both the PUK and the YPG for that transnational element of that campaign. Can I bring you in on that? Perhaps maybe with, I don't know how deep into Kurdish politics you want to go into, but I'll let you decide in terms of the whole, let's say, internal PUK aspects of this as well, and the security configurations in Iraqi Kurdistan and in Suli. The floor is yours, Lahib.
Well, I don't think there is much time to go into detail, but to be very brief, yeah, I mean, clearly there is a divide between the main two parties in Kurdistan over the relationship with the PKK, with the PUK being way more sympathetic and more aligned, perhaps even historically. But I mean, most recently we've seen, you know, during the war on ISIS in Kirkuk, for example, you know, there were elements of the PKK fighting in the front lines next to the PUK. That tells you something. And of course, the PUK has a different stance when it comes to the PKK involvement inside Iraq. At the same time, and I think the KRG as a whole is actually, to a degree, benefiting. For the KDP, the PKK presence in their areas is a problem because of Turkey's concerns. But for the PUK and the KDP equally, there is also, as I mentioned before, economic benefits coming in from Syria with oil that is at the end of the day exported through Iraqi Kurdistan, etc. So, and in that sense, there might be more, or there is more, I think, collaboration between the PUK and the PKK than it is with the KDP and the PKK at this point in time. That doesn't mean that you know, the KDP is not willing to come to certain understandings in order to preserve stability. Unfortunately, as the other panelists have been saying here, you know, the reverting into kind of the security policies has been an easier way to date. But I think on both sides, there is a willingness for intra-Kurdish dialogue that takes in also other Kurdish actors apart from the Iraqi ones.
And before I get Denise's two-finger intervention, Lahib, was there a particular position on the part of the PUK towards the Sinjar agreement? And I did have another question, whether you think the Sinjar agreement is still going to be in place a couple of years from now, whether it's effectively dead or not, or whether it was really designed to be a starting point. So have a think about those questions, because I'm going to come back to all of you for some final 1 minute and a half remarks. But Denise, you had a two-finger intervention.
Yeah, just the one bit, I fully agree with Lahib on these relationships. But I would say, even with the PUK, you know, we like to say, and I've said this too, the KDP, you know, wants the PKK out, and the PUK is more amenable, which is true. But even then, there's a line. And at the end of the day, in my view, if you had to say to the PUK leaders, how would you feel about having the PKK remain fixed in Soleimani, and they can compete with you for positions, or they can take your, you know, power relationships, you know, and supersede or join the local, then there's a bit of a red line when it comes to really competing for their own votes and their own constituencies as well. So PKK, they believe it's useful for them to play off the KDP. It's useful for them to gain traction with other groups to advance their own political agenda, but their priorities still remain in Iraq. I don't see them letting go of all of the PUK gains politically and territorially for the PKK. So
agreed, absolutely.
Right? That's my 2 cents. That's all.
Thank you. That's very, very helpful indeed, Denise. I did have a question in terms of how both you and Lahib see the PUK-PMF relationship developing, particularly in the disputed territories, but you can perhaps incorporate that, one or both of you, in your final 1 minute remarks. I did get permission in advance from the panelists to see if we can go 5 minutes over. So I am going to give them a good minute, maybe minute and a half each for some final remarks, thoughts, and reactions. Let's start in reverse order. Let's start with you, Guney, for your final thoughts and reactions.
I want to mention also that, you know, initially in Iraqi Kurdistan, Turkey wanted to partner with Iran in 2020 rather than the KRG. That didn't happen. That's why I think Turkey turned to the KRG now. And I think the previous strategy, which was led mostly by the politicians in the past, and also the intelligence organization in the background, is now being owned more by the Turkish military, which could also have impact on the ground. And on the PUK thing, I want to mention, maybe to illustrate other issues I have in mind, which is that we can analyze politics, sociology, and other geopolitical aspects of the situation. But there are also known unknowns in this situation, especially with regard to the intelligence links between organizations. At least they are unknown to me. But what we know is that it could be. It's not necessarily a black and white thing to say PUK is more pro PKK or close to the PKK, because we've seen some interesting developments in the past where, for example, the PUK's intelligence chief visited the Syrian Democratic Forces commander, the Mazlum Abdi, and the same week when two PKK leaders were killed in a mountain adjacent to Sulaimania, which may suggest the PUK involvement. So it's not necessarily clear like where these different groups stay on different issues.
Thanks, Guney.
Yeah, is it?
Did you have any final 20-second? Do you want to wrap up, Guney? Yeah.
I mean, I think there are like small points when I can mention.
20 seconds.
I'll leave that. I don't think I'll manage.
Okay, we'll have another follow-up discussion, that's for sure. Osman, please.
Thank you, Ranj. The issue regarding the PKK, as far as we are discussing PKK as a terrorist organization and just specific to Iraq, it is important, it is impossible to solve the problem. It is controlling a huge economy. It has some political dimensions in Turkey. It is creating new actors like Mazlum Abdi in Syria, and it is getting institutionalized and behaving as a government-like actor in the Sinjar and in the region. It is governing and during a lack of central governments, and that's why PKK is becoming much more integrated in some regions, and its relations with Hashd Shabi and in Iran, and its role in Syria. It is becoming a much more complex situation, and that's why to tackle with this issue, unless the different countries are coming together and find a middle way and getting PKK on board as well, we can find a solution on that. The only thing maybe then is just sum it up regarding the America is back. Yes, America is back, but America is back to Pacific, not to the Middle East. It is withdrawing its forces from Afghanistan, and that's why the countries in the region and the groups and the people in the region should put their expectations from the United States very limited. And with 2,500 troops in Iraq and the numbered troops in Syria, it's very difficult for the Americans.
Osman, can I interrupt you and ask you very quickly? Yeah. Does the Turkish government believe that its policy and position towards Kirkuk in 2017 and the independence referendum led to where things currently stand in northern Iraq and in Sinjar? Or are those two not tied at all from the Turkish perspective?
To an extent, yes, the policy has resulted in this result, but Turkey probably cannot have behaved in another way. Its relations with Iran was transactional, not a tactical or strategic relation, just against any kind of independence. And as far as the Kurds in northern Iraq thinks that it was not a good thing to make such a step over there, and that's why it's a past history. Yes, it created the existing situation, but it was very difficult for Turkey to behave in different manner. Let me stop here. Thank you so much. But the last sentence again, the sentence at the outset: Iran is in the elephant in the room.
Thanks very much, Osman. Denise, please.
Thanks. I'll just 2 cents in terms of looking to the future. Yes, you're not going to see from the U.S. perspective, we will continue to engage diplomatically. This is very important. Maintaining stability in Iraq still remains important, and we will continue with our partners. But enhancing, somebody asked, what can Turkey do? Continue to work with the Iraqi government, enhance the institutions of the state. I mean, this is not, like I said, it's not just PKK. You've got all these Hashd Shab, you've got all these PMF, all these local militia groups now, somebody said the sectarian militias, the militarization of ethno-religious groups. And so the more that the state or official institutions can provide alternatives, security, salaries, jobs, then the less amount of support that these groups like the PKK will get from local populations. So that can Turkey, again, the opening of the consulate is great, business relationships, and reinforcing Iraqi state institutions and these relationships. Second point, finally, is a lot of this also depends on Syria outcomes. We do not have a partner in the Syrian government in Damascus with whom we can work at this moment. But Turkey's concern about its territorial integrity at southern borders is also tied in our ability, right, to work with some of these groups. It also depends on this neighboring state who's also broken. So having a partner in Damascus that can also, provide some of the types of local decentralized outlets, the controlling of borders that Turkey so importantly needs, will also help us factor into negotiating some of these problems in the future. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Denise. Lahib, the floor is yours.
Thanks. Well, I'll answer your question about the Sinjar agreement, since that was the main point that I raised. So I think under the current circumstances, it will not be implemented, unfortunately. I think that if there is a new effort at dialogue with the new government after elections, then perhaps there may be, a reconsideration on all parts in terms of how that configuration can look like. But it will have to, in one way or another, include all the local groups. Otherwise, it won't work. And that means, as we've mentioned several times, the PMF groups have their own interests in this area, but they also carry the interests of their protege, and so Iran needs to, either Sinjar becomes a priority for all of these countries, including the US, Turkey, and Iran, or it does not, and it will continue to be left in the state, because I do not think that the KRG and Baghdad alone are going to be able to impose a new administration and a new security configuration that will please all sides in the current framework that the agreement has.
Final 30 seconds, Lahib. How do you see the PUK-PMF relationship developing?
Right. So, so that's separate from Sinjar, of course, because the PUK doesn't have much to do there. But if we look in other parts of disputed territories, like Kirkuk, for example, the PUK-PMF relation has been very important, especially post-2017, when the Peshmerga had to withdraw and the KDP withdrew politically. So, of course, there is very much interaction, both economically but also security-wise, between the PUK and the PMF in sharing the space. And I think that will continue to go on even after elections. And I think that is when we're going to see the more interesting dynamics in terms of how that will play out, very much dependent on whether the KDP actually will come back to campaign and participate in elections in Kirkuk. So that's one area of example shortly.
Well, that's very helpful. Thanks so much, Lahib. I'm afraid that is all we have time for, but this has been so insightful. I'm also very pleased that we did have a series of forward-looking policy recommendations, possible mechanisms, avenues through which to try and avert a major conflict, some interesting peace-building recommendations there, but also a very helpful diagnosis and appraisal of where things stand from the perspective of the Turkish government. I do hope you'll all join us again as we continue the discussion. This is the first of a series of conversations I hope we'll be having on both Turkey-Iraq relations, but also all the other issues and elements of this relationship and of the various crises in the country. A huge thank you to all our participants. I'm very glad our speakers made time to join us today. Very grateful. Huge thanks to you, members of the audience, for joining us. I do hope you'll continue to engage with the conversation as we continue to look at these various issues and challenges. And of course, a huge thanks to the Carnegie Corporation of New York. Thanks very much indeed.